Hey, everyone. Welcome to Storytelling Time, the place where every story comes alive. If you love getting lost in thrilling tales, gripping mysteries, and epic adventures, you're in the right spot. I'm your storyteller, and here, we don't just tell stories, we bring them to life. Whether it's fantasy, mystery, horror, or even a bit of comedy, we're all about immersion. So grab a snack, get comfy, and prepare for a journey that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single chapter. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the Storytelling Time family. Let's dive into the stories that await, starting now. The subway car rocked gently, its fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a dying pulse. The kind of light that made everything look slightly diseased. Natalie sat alone at one end, her tote bag tucked between her knees, earbuds in, but no music played. She hadn't listened to anything in months. Not really. The silence suited the hollow ache in her chest, a constant companion these days. It was a silence that amplified the whispers of her past, the memories she desperately tried to keep buried. She preferred the anonymity of the late-night commute, the anonymity of being a ghost. The other passengers, few and far between at this hour, were mere shadows themselves, a businessman with a loosened tie and drooping eyelids, a young couple whispering in their own world, a hunched figure clutching a paper bag. Natalie observed them all, undetected, a skill honed over years of wanting to be invisible. She was a watcher, a phantom flitting through the edges of other people's lives, careful not to leave a trace. Her reflection in the smudged window watched her back, dark eyes, shadowed from too many sleepless nights, and lips pressed together in a near-constant frown. She didn't dress to stand out. Oversized coat, jeans, plain boots. It worked. People forgot her the second they looked away. That was the point. To blend, to disappear, to avoid the probing gazes that seemed to strip her bare, exposing the raw, wounded core she kept hidden from the world. The train screeched to a halt at the next stop, the doors hissing open with a sigh. A gust of stale air swept through the car, carrying the scent of damp concrete and something vaguely metallic. Natalie didn't move, didn't even blink. She simply watched as a man boarded. He was unremarkable at first glance. Khakis. Fleece jacket zipped to the chest. Hair neat, face clean-shaven. He looked like someone who read self-help books and watered his plants on schedule. Harmless. But something in the way he walked, measured, deliberate, made the hair on the back of her neck lift. It was subtle, a barely perceptible tension in his posture, a tightness around his eyes. It was the stillness beneath the surface that put her on edge. He scanned the car, his gaze lingering for a moment too long on Natalie before settling on the seat directly across from her. Empty train car. Dozens of other seats. Yet he chose the one that put him directly in her line of sight. It felt deliberate, a calculated move in a game she didn't even know she was playing. A small smile touched his lips. Not warm. Just, polite. Predatory. It was hard to tell, and that uncertainty sent a shiver down Natalie's spine. She glanced at him once, her eyes flicking over his face, trying to decipher the unreadable expression. Then she looked away, feigning disinterest, focusing on the graffiti-scarred wall of the tunnel as the train lurched forward. Her fingers, hidden in the depths of her coat pocket, brushed the cold, familiar metal of her switchblade. Habit. Not fear. She always carried it. Just in case. But tonight, the weight of it felt different, heavier, a grim reminder of the violence she was trying to escape. The train clattered onward, the rhythmic rumble a strange counterpoint to the growing unease in the pit of Natalie's stomach. 2 stops passed. Neither spoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions, with a sense of dread that seemed to seep into the very air of the car. Then he said, in a tone light enough to be a joke, "You ever get that weird feeling, like you know someone, but can't place where from?" Natalie pulled one earbud out slowly, the movement deliberate, cautious. As if any sudden noise might shatter the fragile sense of control she was clinging to. "Excuse me. You just look familiar," he said with a shrug, the smile widening slightly. "Sorry. Didn't mean to be weird." But his eyes said otherwise. They held a focused intensity that belied his casual tone. She offered a rehearsed smile in return, a practiced curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't think we've met." "No." He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, like an insect under a microscope. "Did you go to Lakewood High?" Her breath caught, just slightly. A flicker of something dark and unwelcome stirred within her. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed facade she wore. She masked it with a blink, forcing her expression to remain blank. "No." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that resonated deep within her bones. "Guess I'm just fishing." But he didn't seem like a fisherman. More like a hunter, patiently circling his prey. The lights flickered again, the sudden dip in illumination casting long, dancing shadows across his face, transforming his features into something sinister and grotesque. Natalie kept her expression still, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, each beat a drumbeat of warning. "Do you always ride this late?" he asked after another stop, his voice a low murmur that seemed to fill the empty space between them, laced with a curiosity that felt invasive, predatory. Natalie stood abruptly, the sudden movement drawing his attention. "I have to go." As the doors hissed open, offering a temporary escape, he stood too. "Wait, hey, sorry. You dropped this." He held up a folded paper, his fingers gripping it with a strange possessiveness, as if it were a lifeline connecting them. She hadn't dropped anything. Her bag was still clutched tightly between her knees. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and this man. But something, a morbid curiosity, a sense of foreboding, held her rooted to the spot. A dark thread of fate, invisible but undeniable, seemed to be drawing her in. She hesitated, her eyes darting between the open doors and the man's outstretched hand. Something cold brushed her spine, a whisper of danger that resonated deep within her bones, a primal warning she couldn't ignore. "Take it," he said, stepping forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was soft, almost a caress, but there was an underlying edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. "I think it's important." Against her better judgment, against every fiber of her being, she took it. Her fingers brushed his as she took the paper, the contact sending a jolt through her. A spark of something unidentifiable, unsettling, passed between them. The doors closed behind her, sealing her fate. She didn't look back, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not the end. It was just the beginning. Her apartment smelled like cinnamon and bleach, an odd mix that never quite faded no matter how often she cleaned. It was a smell that spoke of a desperate attempt to mask something unpleasant, a fitting metaphor for Natalie's life. She bolted the lock, then the chain, her movements quick and efficient, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then she checked the peephole twice, her eye pressed against the cold metal, scanning the empty hallway outside. The hallway remained empty, the dim fluorescent light casting long, eerie shadows that danced with her paranoia. Only when her heart stopped pounding quite so hard did she dare to unfold the paper. Even then, her hands trembled, the paper crinkling in her grasp. She laid it on her small kitchen table, the worn wood scarred with old burns and knife marks, a testament to a life lived on the edge. It was a photograph. Black and white. Grainy. The kind of image that felt illicit, voyeuristic. A teenage girl, maybe 15 or 16, was bound to a chair in a dark room. Her face was bruised, swollen, her eyes wide with terror. A gag was tied tightly around her mouth, muffling her screams. Natalie's stomach turned, bile rising in her throat. It was a scene of brutal violation, a glimpse into a world of darkness and cruelty she thought she had left behind. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen it, but she couldn't. Her eyes were glued to the image, drawn in by a morbid fascination, a horrifying sense of recognition. The girl's fear was palpable, radiating from the photograph like a physical force. Natalie flipped the photo over, her fingers fumbling with the edges. 2 words were written on the back, scrawled in angry block letters, "Your turn." The message was clear, unambiguous. It was a threat, a promise of violence, a chilling echo from her past. But whose turn was it? The girl in the photo? Or Natalie herself? She stared at the picture again, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it. The lighting. The angle. The shadows. They felt familiar. A shiver ran down her spine, a cold premonition of danger. It was more than just a photograph, it was a memory, a fragment of a nightmare she had tried to bury. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she stumbled to the sink, her hand clamped over her mouth. She retched, but nothing came up. The metallic tang of fear filled her mouth, mingling with the phantom taste of cinnamon and bleach. With a trembling hand, she reached for a lighter on the counter. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a stranger, gaunt, haunted, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the girl in the photograph. She held the lighter to the corner of the photo, the flame sputtering to life. The paper curled and blackened, the image distorting as the fire consumed it. The girl's face twisted in agony, her silent scream echoing in Natalie's mind. Smoke filled the small kitchen, acrid and suffocating. Natalie watched, mesmerized, as the photo burned, as the past went up in flames. But the memory had already clawed its way in. It was there, in the back of her mind, festering, refusing to be silenced. The man from the subway. The photograph. The message. They were all connected, pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve, a door she didn't want to open. But the door was open now. The past was reaching out for her, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she couldn't run anymore. The man, she started calling him khakis in her head, a detached label that helped her maintain a sliver of control, showed up again. It was a week after the subway encounter, a week filled with a gnawing unease that clung to her like a shadow. She jumped at every unexpected sound, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife in her pocket, her sleep plagued by fragmented nightmares of dark rooms and terrified screams. The first time, it was across the street from her building. She'd been walking home from a late shift at the cafe, the city lights blurring through the dampness of the night. A figure stood beneath a flickering streetlight, motionless, watching her. Even from that distance, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with that unsettling stillness. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. For a long moment, they stood there, separated by the width of the street, locked in a silent confrontation. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, melting into the darkness like a phantom. Natalie didn't move until her legs screamed in protest, until the cold had seeped into her bones. The second time was inside the cafe where she worked mornings, a small, bustling place filled with the aroma of coffee and the chatter of early risers. She was behind the counter, forcing a smile as she handed a latte to a customer, when she saw him. He sat in the corner, at a small table bathed in the weak morning light, a cup of coffee in front of him. He never touched it. He didn't speak. Didn't gesture. Didn't even blink. He simply sat there, watching her. His gaze was unwavering, intense, like he was cataloging her every twitch, every nervous movement. It was a silent invasion, a violation of her carefully constructed privacy. Natalie broke. The carefully constructed wall of indifference she had built around herself crumbled. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a trapped animal. Her hands began to shake, and she had to grip the counter to steady herself. She could feel his eyes on her, burning into her, stripping away her defenses. She fled into the back room, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her vision blurring with tears. Her boss, a kindly, oblivious woman named Brenda, found her huddled in a corner, her face pale and clammy. Natalie mumbled something about feeling unwell and went home. The image of Kakis's unwavering stare burned into her mind. That night, she ran a background check using the name on the receipt from the cafe, Peter Lang. It was a desperate attempt to regain some control, to put a name to the face that haunted her. Nothing. No credit score. No driver's license. No voting record. Not even a birth certificate. It was as if he had appeared from nowhere, a ghost with a name but no past. The more she dug, the more elusive he became, the more her fear escalated. Then came the email. It arrived in the dead of night, a silent intrusion into the digital sanctuary of her inbox. No text. Just a subject line, "Let's go home." Attached was a Google Maps pin. Her mother's old house. The house on Hemlock Lane. The place she had tried so hard to forget. It took her 3 hours to convince herself to go. 3 hours of pacing her tiny apartment, of arguing with herself, of battling the conflicting urges of fear and a morbid curiosity. The place had been condemned for years after the electrical fire that had claimed her mother's life. No one lived there. No one was supposed to go there. She hadn't been back since she was 17, since the night her life had irrevocably changed. But the email was a summons, a direct challenge she couldn't ignore. It was as if Peter Lang was inside her head, reading her thoughts, anticipating her every move. She parked a block away, the engine of her beat-up car shuddering to a halt. Night cloaked the street in a damp fog, the heavy mist clinging to everything like a shroud. A single street lamp flickered weakly above the overgrown lawn, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the swirling fog. The house leaned, skeletal and sagging, against the oppressive darkness. Paint peeled from the rotting wood, revealing the decay beneath. The windows were dark, empty sockets staring out at the world. Natalie ducked through a hole in the rusted chain-link fence, the metal groaning in protest, and stepped onto the porch. One board, weakened by years of neglect and the relentless assault of the elements, snapped beneath her boot, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The air inside smelled like mildew and burnt wood, a cloying mix that spoke of death and decay. The wallpaper peeled in wet curls, revealing the crumbling plaster beneath. Her flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating forgotten furniture draped in dust sheets, scattered picture frames filled with ghostly images, mold-kissed corners where shadows writhed like living things. She moved through the house like a trespasser in a tomb, each step echoing with the ghosts of the past. Down the hallway. Past the room that had been her mother's, a room Natalie hadn't entered since that fateful night. To the door. The basement. The knob turned. Unlocked. As if he had been expecting her. A cold draft snaked out from the darkness below, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid and metallic, that made her stomach churn. The stairs groaned under her weight as she descended, each creak a mournful lament from the depths of the house. The cold tightened around her like a noose, constricting her chest, making it hard to breathe. At the bottom, she froze. He was waiting. Kakis. Peter. Whatever his name really was. And next to him, a girl. Tied to a chair. Gagged. Barefoot. Shaking. Natalie's hand tightened on the handle of her flashlight, the beam shaking as it swept across the scene before her. The basement was a grotesque tableau, a macabre stage set for a horror play. The air hung heavy with the stench of mildew and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic that she couldn't quite place. It was the smell of fear, of violation, of death. He was waiting. Khakis. Peter. Whatever his name really was. He stood with an unnerving calmness, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He seemed almost expectant. And next to him, a girl. Tied to a chair. Gagged. Barefoot. Shaking. Natalie's breath hitched in her throat. The girl was young, no more than 16 or 17. Her eyes, wide and terrified, were fixed on Natalie, pleading, accusing. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She was a mirror image of the girl in the photograph, a horrifying echo of the past. Natalie's hand instinctively went to her coat, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of her switchblade. "What the hell is this?" she managed to croak, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. The words echoed in the oppressive silence of the basement, bouncing off the damp stone walls. Peter stepped forward, his movements fluid and controlled, like a predator stalking its prey. There was no hesitation, no remorse in his eyes, only a chilling determination. "Thought you might want to see the past up close," he said, his voice low and steady. "What are you talking about?" Natalie's voice cracked, betraying the fear that was clawing at her insides. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but the pieces didn't fit. It was like stepping into a nightmare, a twisted reality where the rules didn't apply. He pulled out a second photo from his jacket, the gesture deliberate, theatrical. He held it toward her like an offering, a twisted communion. It was her. 17. Smiling. Standing in this very basement. Next to another girl, bound and bleeding. Lacey. The air rushed out of Natalie's lungs. She staggered back, her back hitting the cold, damp wall with a thud. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, shattering on the concrete floor, plunging the basement into near darkness. Only a sliver of light from the single bulb at the top of the stairs illuminated the scene, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like malevolent spirits. "That's not," she began, her voice a strangled whisper, but the words died in her throat. The photo was undeniable. It was her, frozen in time, a ghost from her past. "Oh, it is," Peter said, his voice a soft, deadly caress. He took another step closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You were so proud of yourself, weren't you? Queen of the damned." She shook her head, her mind reeling. "That was a prank. I didn't know it would go that far." The memory of that night, a drunken haze of teenage cruelty, flickered through her mind, a brief, horrifying glimpse into a past she had desperately tried to bury. "I came home late that night," Peter said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She was still breathing. Barely. "I carried her out. Through snow. Through traffic. No one helped. They just stared. Like she was garbage. She made it through the night. She died 2 days later." Natalie's hands trembled uncontrollably. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, chilling her to the core. "She told me your name," he said, his gaze fixed on her, accusatory, unforgiving. "Said you laughed when she begged for help." "No," she whispered, the denial weak, pathetic. Guilt, sharp and visceral, pierced through the numbness. "That's not true." I didn't laugh. Didn't you? Peter tilted his head, his expression a mask of cold indifference. Or did you just not care? Were you too busy enjoying the show? Natalie felt something twist inside her. Not guilt, no, something worse. Recognition. A sickening understanding of the depths of her own capacity for cruelty. I didn't kill her, she said, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. You didn't stop them either, Peter said, his voice hardening. You stood by and watched. You were just as guilty. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the girl tied to the chair. This is Ava. Her daughter. My niece. Natalie's knees gave out. The floor rushed up to meet her as she sank into the cold, unforgiving embrace of the basement floor. The reality of the situation crashed down on her, crushing her with its weight. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about repeating the past, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. Why? She whispered, the question a broken plea. I wanted you to feel it, Peter said, his voice devoid of pity. The fear. The confusion. The helplessness. The same way she felt. Tears welled in Natalie's eyes, blurring her vision. She looked at Ava, the girl in the chair. She was young. Terrified. So much like Lacey. A wave of nausea washed over Natalie, followed by a profound sense of shame. You don't have to hurt her, she said, her voice thick with tears. Please. Peter tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. You mean like you did? She looked at Ava again, her heart breaking. She reached into her coat, her fingers trembling as they closed around the familiar grip of her switchblade. Pulled it out. Then dropped it. The metallic clatter echoed in the silence, a final surrender. I'm sorry, she said, sobbing, the words torn from her throat. I'm so sorry. Peter's eyes flickered, but there was no triumph in them. No rage. Only something colder, something more unsettling. Pity? Disgust? She couldn't tell. He kicked the blade away, the metal skittering across the floor. You're not the only one who can play predator, he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. A week later, the police broke down the door after an anonymous tip. The battering ram splintered the rotting wood, the sound echoing through the condemned house like a gunshot. Detective Mallory, a woman with tired eyes and a grin set to her jaw, led the charge, her hand resting on the holstered weapon at her hip. Inside, the scene was just as the tipster had described. The basement, damp and cold, a grotesque tableau of violence and despair. The girl, Ava, was there, alive but shaken. She had managed to free herself from the chair using a shard of broken glass, her wrists raw and bleeding where the duct tape had been. Mallory found her huddled in a corner, clutching a dirty blanket around her shoulders, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. The duct tape, marked with her fingerprints, still clung to her wrists. There were two other bodies in the basement. One male. One female. They were lying on the cold concrete floor, side by side, their forms twisted and contorted. It was clear they had died violently. The male figure was Peter Lang. His face was unrecognizable, a mass of blood and broken bone. The female was Natalie. Her once familiar features were contorted in a mask of terror. The autopsy reports were inconclusive. Burned fingerprints. Facial trauma. No clear identification could be made of either body. The destruction was too complete. There were no signs of who killed whom. No murder weapon was found. The scene was a chaotic jumble of violence, a puzzle with missing pieces. Only one thing was left behind, a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded in that basement. A photo. Nailed to the wall. Blood-streaked. Natalie at 17. Smiling. Innocent. And in thick red ink across the top. You can't trust anyone. Detective Mallory stared at the photograph, the image of young Natalie's smiling face a stark contrast to the carnage of the basement. The message scrawled across the top in blood-red ink sent a shiver down her spine. You can't trust anyone. It was a chilling warning, a final, taunting whisper from the grave. Mallory had seen a lot of gruesome crime scenes in her years on the force, but this one was different. It wasn't just the violence, it was the atmosphere of the place, the feeling of wrongness that permeated the very walls of the condemned house. It was like the house itself was a character in this twisted drama, a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded within its decaying walls. The other officers moved around her, their voices hushed, their expressions grim. The forensics team meticulously documented the scene, their cameras flashing, their gloved hands collecting samples. Mallory watched them go about their work, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Ava, the young girl who had been found alive in the basement, was at the hospital, under observation. Mallory had spoken to her briefly, but the girl was still in shock, her memories fragmented and confused. She remembered being taken, the fear, the darkness, but the rest was a blur. The two bodies in the basement were a mystery. The autopsy reports had come back inconclusive, as expected. Burned fingerprints, extensive facial trauma. Dental records were useless. They were Jane and John Doe's, victims of a violence so extreme it had obliterated their identities. Mallory had a sinking feeling she knew who they were. She walked out of the basement, the cold night air a welcome relief after the oppressive atmosphere inside. The fog had thickened, swirling around the house like a shroud, obscuring the already skeletal structure. The yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, a stark barrier between the world of the living and the secrets buried within the house. As she stood there, watching the fog dance around the condemned house, Mallory couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far from over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. Who was Peter Lang? What was his connection to Natalie? And what had happened in that basement? The photograph, with its cryptic message, nagged at her. It was a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in blood and violence. Was it a clue? A confession? Or just the taunting words of a killer? Mallory knew one thing for sure, she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth, no matter how dark or disturbing it might be. The ghosts of Hemlock Lane demanded justice, and she was determined to give them a voice. Mallory's investigation began with the girl, Ava. She was physically unharmed, but the emotional trauma was evident. Mallory sat by her bedside in the sterile hospital room, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Ava stared blankly at the wall, her eyes distant and haunted. Ava, Mallory said gently, her voice low and soothing. Can you tell me what happened? Ava flinched at the sound of her name, her body tensing beneath the thin white sheet. She turned her head slowly, her gaze focusing on Mallory with a flicker of recognition. The house, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took me to the house. Peter Lang? Mallory asked. Ava nodded, her eyes filling with tears. He said it was time for her to pay. He said she deserved to feel what Lacey felt. Lacey. The name sent a jolt of understanding through Mallory. It was the name Lacey had said in the 911 call, the name Natalie had denied knowing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, revealing a dark and twisted picture. What else do you remember? Mallory asked, her voice patient. Ava closed her eyes, her face contorting in pain. The basement, the chair, the gag. I was so scared. I thought I was going to die. "You're safe now," Mallory assured her. "We're going to find out why this happened. Can you tell me anything about the other woman? Natalie?" Ava shook her head, her brow furrowed in confusion. I don't remember much. She was there, at the end. But she was different. Scared. She dropped the knife. Dropped the knife. It was a detail that didn't fit with the image Mallory had formed of Natalie, a cold-blooded killer who had participated in a brutal crime and then disappeared for years. Could she have changed? Or was it all an act? Mallory left the hospital with more questions than answers. The case was becoming increasingly complex, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. She needed to know more about Natalie, about her past, about the events that had led to the tragedy in the basement. Her search led her to Lakewood High, the school Natalie had attended. Old yearbooks revealed a smiling teenager, a far cry from the haunted woman in the basement. But as Mallory dug deeper, she uncovered whispers of a darker side, rumors of bullying, of a group of popular kids who ruled the school with cruelty and impunity. Lacey. Her name came up again and again. She had been different, an outcast, a target. And Natalie had been among those who tormented her. The pieces of the past were falling into place. Mallory began to see a pattern, a cycle of violence and revenge that had stretched across the years, culminating in the events at the house on Hemlock Lane. But the biggest question of all remained, who had killed Natalie and Peter? And why? The deeper Mallory dug into Natalie's past, the more unsettling the picture became. Lakewood High, once a place of learning and growth, was revealed to be a breeding ground for cruelty, where social hierarchies were enforced with viciousness. Natalie, driven by a desire for acceptance, had been both a participant and a victim, caught in a web of toxic relationships and unspoken rules. Lacey's story was particularly heart-wrenching. She was an easy target, an outcast who didn't fit in with the rigid social structure of the school. She was subjected to relentless bullying, both verbal and physical, and Natalie had often stood by and watched, or even participated, driven by a desperate need to belong. One incident stood out in particular, a cruel prank that had gone horribly wrong. A party in the basement of an abandoned house, a group of teenagers fueled by alcohol and a thirst for cruelty, and Lacey, bound and humiliated. Natalie had been there, laughing, egged on by the crowd. The memory of that night haunted Mallory. She could almost feel the cold dampness of the basement, hear Lacey's muffled cries, see Natalie's face contorted in a twisted smile. It was a scene of depravity that defied comprehension, a glimpse into the dark heart of human nature. Peter Lang's connection to Lacey added another layer of complexity to the case. He was her older brother, a shadowy figure who had always lurked on the periphery of Lacey's life, protective and watchful. He had witnessed his sister's suffering, her pain, her humiliation. And he had never forgotten. Mallory began to suspect that Peter's return was not a coincidence. He had come back to settle a score, to avenge his sister's death. The basement in the condemned house was not a random location, it was a stage, a place where the past could be relived, where Natalie could be forced to confront her sins. The question that plagued Mallory was whether Natalie had been a willing participant in Peter's plan or another victim. Had she been lured to the house under false pretenses, only to be confronted with the horrors of her past? Or had she been a willing accomplice, seeking her own twisted form of redemption? The answer, Mallory knew, lay buried in the secrets of the past, in the dark corners of the human heart. And she was determined to find it, no matter how painful the journey might be. Mallory's investigation led her to the forgotten corners of Lakewood, to the people who still carried the scars of the past. She interviewed former classmates of Natalie and Lacey, teachers who remembered them, and even a few townspeople who had witnessed the events that had unfolded years ago. The stories she heard painted a disturbing picture of Lakewood High as a microcosm of society's darker impulses. Cliques reigned supreme, and those who didn't fit in were often subjected to brutal treatment. Natalie, initially an outsider herself, had clawed her way into the popular crowd, driven by a desperate need for acceptance. In the process, she had abandoned her own sense of empathy and participated in the persecution of others. Lacey, on the other hand, was remembered as a kind and sensitive girl, but also vulnerable and isolated. She had become the target of the popular clique's cruelty, a scapegoat for their own insecurities and frustrations. The bullying had started small. Mean-spirited jokes and whispered insults, but it had escalated over time, culminating in the horrific events of that night in the basement. As Mallory pieced together the events of that night, a clearer picture of Natalie's involvement began to emerge. She had been there, laughing, participating, driven by a desire to please her peers. But there was also a sense that she had been trapped, caught in a web of social pressure and fear. Peter Lang's role in the story also became clearer. He had been fiercely protective of his sister, her only ally in a hostile world. He had witnessed her suffering, her humiliation, and her despair. And he had never forgiven those who had hurt her. His return to Lakewood was not just about revenge, it was about confronting Natalie with the consequences of her actions, forcing her to relive the past. The question of whether Natalie was a victim or a perpetrator became increasingly complex. Mallory began to suspect that she was both, a woman haunted by her past, trapped between her desire for redemption and the weight of her guilt. As Mallory delved deeper into the past, she also began to uncover the secrets that the town of Lakewood had tried to bury. The darkness that had festered beneath the surface of the seemingly idyllic community, the unspoken truths that had shaped the lives of its inhabitants. It was a story of cruelty, betrayal, and the enduring power of the past to haunt the present. The truth of what happened to Lacey that night was buried deep within the memories of those who had been there, distorted by time, alcohol, and a collective desire to forget. Mallory had to piece it together from fragmented accounts, conflicting stories, and the occasional, reluctant admission. The party had been held in the basement of the abandoned house on Hemlock Lane, a place that held a dark allure for the teenagers of Lakewood. It was a place to drink, to experiment, to escape the watchful eyes of their parents. That night, the atmosphere had been particularly charged, fueled by cheap beer and a sense of reckless abandon. Lacey had been there, an unwilling participant. She had been brought to the party by a boy who had pretended to be her friend, only to abandon her as soon as they arrived. She was alone, vulnerable, and out of place in the raucous crowd. The bullying had started subtly, with whispered insults and mocking laughter. But as the night wore on, the taunts became more aggressive, more vicious. Someone had the idea to play a prank, a joke that quickly spiraled out of control. Lacey was grabbed, dragged to the center of the basement, and tied to an old, wooden chair. A gag was shoved into her mouth, silencing her cries. The others, Natalie included, had stood in a circle around her, laughing, jeering, their faces flushed with excitement and cruelty. Natalie's role in the events of that night was complex. She had been a follower, desperate to belong, to please the popular crowd. She had laughed, yes, but there was also a part of her that had felt a flicker of unease, a sense that things were going too far. But the fear of social ostracization, the desire to be accepted, had been stronger. She had silenced her conscience and joined in the torment. As the night progressed, the prank escalated. Lacey was humiliated, degraded, subjected to a series of increasingly cruel acts. The line between a joke and torture had blurred, and no one had stepped in to stop it. Natalie had watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She remembered Lacey's eyes, wide with terror, pleading for help. She remembered the sound of her muffled cries, the feel of the rough rope against her skin. And she remembered the laughter, her own laughter, mingling with the others. The memory was a brand on her soul, a stain that would never wash away. It was a moment of moral failure, a betrayal of her own humanity. And it had set in motion a chain of events that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The night ended in chaos. Someone had called the police, and the teenagers had scattered, leaving Lacey alone in the basement. Natalie had fled with the others, the sound of Lacey's cries echoing in her ears. She had tried to forget, to bury the memory, but it had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to resurface. Peter Lang was a ghost, a shadow that had haunted the edges of Lakewood for years. He had never truly left, not in his heart. While Natalie had tried to bury the past, he had carried it with him, the weight of his sister's suffering a constant burden. Lacey's death had shattered him. He had been her protector, her confidant, her only friend in a world that had often been cruel to her. He had witnessed firsthand the bullying she endured, the petty insults, the escalating cruelty. And he had felt powerless to stop it. The night she died, something had broken within him. The grief had been all-consuming, a black hole that threatened to swallow him whole. But beneath the grief, a cold seed of vengeance had taken root. He couldn't let those who had hurt his sister go unpunished. He began to plan, meticulously, patiently, like a predator stalking its prey. He studied Natalie, watching her from afar, learning her habits, her routines, her weaknesses. He saw the isolation, the fear that clung to her like a shroud, and he knew he had found her vulnerability. The abandoned house on Hemlock Lane became the centerpiece of his plan, a stage for a twisted reenactment of the past. He chose it not only for its connection to the original crime but also for its symbolic significance. It was a place of decay and neglect, a reflection of the rot that had festered in Lakewood for so many years. He lured Natalie there with the promise of answers, the lure of confronting her past. The email, the map pin, the cryptic message, all were carefully crafted to draw her into his web. He wanted her to feel the same fear, the same helplessness that Lacey had felt. Peter's plan was not just about revenge, it was about justice, in his own twisted way. He wanted Natalie to understand the consequences of her actions, to confront the darkness within herself. He wanted to force her to acknowledge the pain she had inflicted. But as his plan unfolded, Peter found himself increasingly consumed by his own darkness. The line between avenger and monster began to blur. His desire for justice twisted into a thirst for vengeance, threatening to consume him entirely. The anonymous tip that led the police to the house on Hemlock Lane came from a payphone on the edge of town, a relic from a bygone era, untouched by the digital age. The call was brief, the voice distorted and mechanical, providing only the address and a chilling warning, "She's there. And he's going to make her pay." Detective Mallory traced the call, but the payphone yielded no clues. It had been wiped clean, devoid of fingerprints or any other identifying evidence. The call had been a ghost in the machine, a whisper from the shadows. Mallory reviewed the recording of the call, again and again, searching for any hint of the caller's identity. The distorted voice was unsettling, inhuman, masking any trace of emotion or personality. It was as if the caller was a puppet, a mere instrument in a larger, more sinister game. The discovery of the payphone deepened the mystery surrounding the case. Who had made the call? How did they know about Peter Lang's plan? And why had they waited until the last moment to alert the police? Mallory considered several possibilities. Was the caller an accomplice of Peter Lang, someone who had helped him set up the confrontation and then had a change of heart? Or were they a third party, someone with their own agenda, manipulating the events from behind the scenes? As Mallory delved deeper into the investigation, she began to suspect that the anonymous tipster was someone connected to the past, someone who had been present that night in the basement years ago. Someone who had witnessed the cruelty inflicted on Lacey and had been haunted by it ever since. The realization sent a chill down her spine. It meant that the darkness of the past was not confined to Peter Lang and Natalie. It had spread, infecting others, shaping their lives, and driving them to acts of violence and desperation. The anonymous tipster, Mallory realized, held the key to unlocking the final secrets of the case. They were the missing piece of the puzzle, the link between the past and the present. And she was determined to find them, no matter how long it took. The confrontation took place not in the condemned house, but in the abandoned Lakewood High School. The building, a relic of Natalie and Lacey's past, stood as a silent testament to the darkness that had taken root in the town. Mallory received a second anonymous tip, delivered in the same distorted voice, directing her to the school's auditorium. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty seats. The stage, where countless school plays and assemblies had once taken place, was now the setting for a deadly showdown. Mallory entered cautiously, her gun drawn, her senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. As she reached the center of the auditorium, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Ms. Peterson, Natalie and Lacey's former English teacher. She was an elderly woman, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. But tonight, there was a steely glint in her gaze, a resolve that Mallory had never seen before. "You," Mallory said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was you, wasn't it?" Ms. Peterson nodded slowly. "I couldn't let it go on. Not again. Lacey was a bright, beautiful girl. They took that from her. And Natalie. Natalie was lost, trapped in their world. I tried to reach her, but it was too late." "You killed them," Mallory said, her voice hardening. "I gave them what they deserved," Ms. Peterson replied, her voice unwavering. "They were both victims and perpetrators. The cycle had to be broken." Ms. Peterson revealed that she had been a silent witness to the bullying Lacey endured. She had seen Natalie's transformation from a vulnerable outsider to a participant in the cruelty. The guilt and helplessness had haunted her for years, festering like an untreated wound. When Peter Lang returned, seeking his own form of justice, Ms. Peterson saw an opportunity. She manipulated him, guiding him, using him as her instrument. The anonymous tips, the distorted voice, it was all her doing. She had orchestrated the confrontation in the basement, intending for Natalie and Peter to destroy each other. But Ms. Peterson's plan had gone awry. Natalie had shown remorse, a flicker of humanity that Ms. Peterson hadn't expected. Peter, consumed by vengeance, had become the true monster. In the end, violence consumed them both. The confrontation in the auditorium was brief and tragic. Ms. Peterson, armed with a hidden weapon, lunged at Mallory. A struggle ensued, a desperate fight for survival in the decaying heart of the school. In the end, Mallory was forced to defend herself. As Ms. Peterson lay dying on the stage, she whispered her final words, "The past, it never truly dies." The aftermath of the confrontation left Lakewood reeling. The revelation that Ms. Peterson, a beloved and respected teacher, was responsible for the deaths of Natalie and Peter Lang sent shockwaves through the community. The townspeople struggled to reconcile the image of the gentle educator with the twisted mastermind who had manipulated events from the shadows. The abandoned high school, once a symbol of youthful innocence, was now a crime scene, its decaying walls echoing with the violence that had taken place within. The auditorium, where countless school plays and assemblies had been held, was now stained with blood, a chilling reminder of the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface of Lakewood for so long. Mallory stood outside the school, watching as the police cars and ambulances departed, their sirens fading into the distance. The fog had finally lifted, revealing the skeletal silhouette of the building against the pale morning sky. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. The case had taken its toll, forcing her to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and the enduring power of the past. Ava was released from the hospital into the care of her remaining family, still traumatized but physically unharmed. The community rallied around her, offering support and compassion. But Mallory knew that the scars of what she had endured would likely remain, a constant reminder of the violence that had touched her life. The investigation into the events at Hemlock Lane was officially closed, but the questions lingered. The media descended on Lakewood, eager to sensationalize the story, to paint a picture of a town consumed by darkness and violence. Mallory refused to participate in their narrative, determined to protect the victims and their families from further exploitation. The town of Lakewood was forced to confront its past. The secrets that had been buried for years were brought to light, exposing the undercurrent of cruelty and indifference that had allowed the bullying of Lacey to go unchecked. There were calls for accountability, for change, for a reckoning with the darkness that had been allowed to fester for so long. Mallory knew that the healing process would be long and difficult. The wounds inflicted by the past ran deep, and the cycle of violence and pain would not be easily broken. But she also saw glimmers of hope, a community coming together, a willingness to confront the truth, a determination to create a better future. Mallory stood at Lacey's grave, the cold wind whipping around her, carrying the scent of rain and freshly turned earth. The small cemetery was located on a hill overlooking Lakewood, the town spread out below like a dark stain on the landscape. It was a place of quiet reflection, a sanctuary for the dead and a reminder of the fragility of life. She had come here often in the weeks following the case, drawn to this place of sorrow and remembrance. She had brought flowers, stood in silence, and tried to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded. But the questions lingered, the answers elusive. The case had changed her. It had stripped away her cynicism, her detachment, forcing her to confront the darkness that lurked within herself and the world around her. She had seen the best and worst of humanity, the capacity for cruelty and violence, but also the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of compassion. As she looked out over Lakewood, Mallory saw a town struggling to heal. The media had moved on, drawn to the next sensational story, but the scars remained. The abandoned high school was finally torn down, replaced by a community center, a symbol of hope and renewal. But the memories of what had happened there would never be completely erased. Ava was doing as well as could be expected. She was living with her aunt, attending therapy, and trying to rebuild her life. She was a survivor, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But she would always carry the weight of her past, the knowledge of the violence that had claimed her mother's life. Mallory knew that the cycle of violence and pain could not be broken overnight. It would take time, patience, and a collective effort to heal the wounds of the past and create a future where the mistakes of Lakewood were not repeated. She turned to leave the cemetery, the wind whipping her hair around her face. As she walked away, she glanced back at Lacey's grave, the inscription on the headstone a simple but powerful reminder, she deserved better. Mallory carried those words with her as she left Lakewood, carrying the weight of the past and the hope for a better future. The case was closed, but the story would stay with her, a haunting reminder of the darkness she had confronted and the lessons she had learned. The world was full of twisted echoes, repeating the same patterns of violence and pain. But it was also full of the possibility of change, the hope that the future might be different.